Hi, Mark Ranis here with Lecture 10.4 on the strength and weakness of various analogies. Today we're going to go through the factors that we've already introduced in a previous lecture. We'll begin with a recap of analogies in general, and then we'll focus in on how we know when analogies are strong or weak. That depends on the number of primary analogs, the variety of the primary analogs, the number and strength of the known commonalities between those analogs, and then the similarity of the known commonalities with the potential commonalities we're trying to find out more about. And then finally, there's a catch-all category called disanalogies that is very important, and we'll cover that last. Well, let's do the recap. In previous episodes, we've learned the definition of an analogy. An analogy is an inductive argument, like a generalization, but it uses knowledge about one or more particulars to generate knowledge about some similar particulars. A generalization uses knowledge about the inferiors of a universal to generate knowledge about the universal itself. So the words in red here are what are different from a generalization to an analogy. We've learned that analogies depend always on at least two analogs. There's the primary analog, which is the thing that we already are pretty familiar with, and the secondary analog, the thing that we would like to know more about. Analogies also depend on at least two commonalities that the analogs may share: the known commonality and the potential commonality. The known commonality is what all of the primary analogs share with the secondary analog, and the potential commonality is something that they may share because they're similar in some other respect. We've learned that no analogy is perfect. They also always include disanalogies, things that make the thing weaker. There are differences between the analogs or between the commonalities that make the analogy seem weaker. And because no analogy is perfect, there is always something like that in there. Very important category. Well, how do we determine strength and weakness in analogies? As with the other inductive arguments, we consider analogies to be stronger or weaker rather than valid or invalid. We can't have certainty, so validity and invalidity are a little bit out of place here. We can only talk about more or less probable, stronger or weaker. The inductive principle gives us a pretty good checklist of the issues we want to consider. In other words, it tells us to worry about the number of particulars that we're looking at, and it tells us to worry about the representativeness of the particulars that we're looking at, and in this case, how representative they are of the thing we want to know more about. And it also tells us that we have to pay close attention to any contrary indications that undercut what we're trying to say. That's a little trickier with analogies than with generalizations because analogies are so flexible and are used in so many different ways, and they have a lot of parts. Sometimes the parts aren't even stated on the face of the analogy. That's when is when we say tying a bow tie is like tying your shoes. Well, a lot of the things that we're learning as the parts of analogy go unstated there. So this is trickier with analogies than it is with most other types of argument. But we can identify a few different categories that all of the factors affecting strength or weakness will fall into: the number of the primary analogs, the representativeness or variety of the primary analogs, the number and strength of the known commonality or commonalities that the analogs share, and then the degree of similarity between what we know they share and what we think they might share, between the known and potential commonalities. And finally, then, any disanalogies. All right, so let's go through these one by one. First, the number of the primary analogs. The inductive principle tells us that we need to have a sufficiently numerous group of particulars on which to base our inductive inference. And here, as with other inductive arguments, sufficiency is always a matter of more or less. And in general, your intuition should be the more the better. And if it is, then your intuition is right. So here are a couple of examples. On the left, we have, if you like the first three Beatles albums, you'll probably like the fourth. And on the right, we have, if you like the first 5 Beatles albums, you'll probably like the sixth. Now, which one of these is stronger, all other things being equal? And indeed, everything is equal here, except for the number of primary analogs that we have. Well, all other things being equal, ceteris paribus, an analogy based on more primary analogs is stronger than an analogy based on fewer primary analogs. That is, all other things equal, you would rather be predicting attitudes toward a sixth Beatle album based on 5 previous ones than you would predict attitudes about a fourth Beatles album based on 3 previous ones. In other words, you have a broader base of experience with which to make essentially the same prediction, or a prediction that's of equal boldness, or it's no more aggressive. The 2 predictions are equal in that respect. It's 1 album each. So all other things being equal, more primary analogs, stronger than fewer primary analogs. But the qualification, the ceteris paribus phrase, is important, right? Because here's an example where all other things are not equal. If you like the first 3 Beatles albums, you'll probably like the fourth, okay? Or if you like the first 5 Beatles albums, you'll probably like every album by the Rolling Stones. Now, here, all other things are not equal. So sure, on the right, we have more primary analogs. But at the same time, there's another difference on the right. We're having a more aggressive conclusion. On the left, we're only predicting 1 Beatles album from 3 other Beatles albums. On the right, we're predicting lots of albums by an entirely different band that, sure, is similar to the Beatles in some respects, but very different from the Beatles in other respects. So can we say which one is stronger in the bottom line between the one on the left and the one on the right? No, we can't. These things cut in different directions. There are some things that make the analogy on the right stronger, and there are some things that make the analogy on the right weaker. And those things don't net out in any way. So we can't come up with a definitive answer as to which one is stronger. The thing that we can say definitively is that all other things are not equal in that situation. So that's why we always have that qualification. All other things being equal, the number of primary analogs, when you have more primary analogs, you have a stronger analogy than when you have fewer. All right, let's look at the next factor. The variety of primary analogs. It's not at all clear to me that variety is the right word. And that's in part because of the special nature of analogies. The inductive principle tells us that we have to have a sufficiently representative group of particulars on which to base our inductive inference. With generalizations, we know what that is, right? Because we're trying to reach a conclusion about a universal. So we definitely want the inferiors to come from the universal, and we want them to be broadly based from within the universal. We don't want them to be cherry-picked, so to speak. We don't want there to be any evident bias. So with analogies, the problem is that we want them to be representative of what we want to know more about, but it's not a group. It's another particular, usually. And so it's not easy to know what it would mean to be representative. But nonetheless, here are some examples of what we're trying to get at here. On the left, if you like the first 3 Beatles albums you heard, you'll probably like all Beatles albums. Or on the right, if you like the first 3 albums the Beatles recorded, you'll probably like all Beatles albums. Now, these are identical, except that on the left, we're basing it on 3 Beatles albums chosen maybe at random, but certainly from across the Beatles' career. Whereas on the right, we're choosing 3 albums that are closest in time, all from the same part of the Beatles' career. Well, the first 3 albums the Beatles recorded are likely to be more like each other, and that might make them less representative of all Beatles albums. So, all other things being equal, an analogy that's based on a more diverse group of primary analogs is stronger than an analogy based on a more specialized group of primary analogs. You would rather be predicting, if you have to predict whether someone will like all Beatles albums, you'd rather have 3 albums that show a range of the Beatles style than something that focuses only on how they were at the beginning. And if you listen to a song from their last album, Revolution No. 9 off of the White Album, and compare that to I Want to Hold Your Hand, that's a very different style of music. And there are, in fact, many people who like either the early Beatles but not the late, or the late and not the early. That happens. So that's what we're trying to get at when we talk about the variety of the primary analogs. Okay. Let's look at the third factor, the number and strength of known commonalities. So all analogies depend on similarity. We know that. They depend on known commonalities between the analogs. And both the number and the significance, that is the strength of the commonalities, matter. So, for example, here's an example based on number. We can say maybe Smith and Jones are considering being roommates in college or something, right? So Smith and Jones will probably have a lot in common because they both like fishing. Well, that's okay. Uh, but then we can say Smith and Jones will probably have a lot in common because they both like fishing, jazz, and poker. Well, fishing is something, but fishing, jazz, and poker it seems like Smith and Jones share more in common based on the number of commonalities here. And so we would feel more confident in making a prediction that they will have other unspecified things in common when we have more of these things to go on. So all other things being equal, an analogy based on more known commonalities is going to be stronger. But it can also depend on what I'll call the significance, the predictive power of the commonalities. They're not all equal. For example, Smith and Jones will probably have a lot in common because they both like Italian food. Versus Smith and Jones will probably have a lot in common because they're both Catholic. Now, in this case, it isn't the number of known commonalities that matters, it's one in each side, one on the left and one on the right. But is there a difference between liking Italian food and being Catholic? Sure, there is, right? Most people like Italian food. That's not that distinctive. To like Italian food is not necessarily to put yourself, to classify yourself as a certain sort of person. But Catholicism, that affects the way you see the whole world, right? If we say that Smith and Jones are both Catholic, we're talking about something that is likely to be and certainly should be at the heart of how they view themselves as people. So it has much more predictive value. In the book, I think I use an example of zodiac signs versus sibling relationships. I don't know exactly what the word is for this, but strength, significance, predictive power. There's something about some commonalities being a better source of prediction than others. Can reasonable people disagree about which ones are stronger? Yeah, sure. If it's fishing versus jazz, I'm not sure how we sort that one out. But this is a factor that you always want to consider when you're evaluating whether an analogy is strong or weak. All right, let's move on to the fourth factor, the similarity of known and potential commonalities. That is, how similar is what we know is shared to what we think might be shared, right? We know that all analogies depend on known commonalities to predict something about potential commonalities, but what if they don't have anything to do with each other? For example, if you like the first three Beatles albums you heard, you'll probably like all Beatles albums. Okay. But how about this? If you like the first three Beatles albums you heard, you'll probably like Team Handball. Well, that's a little bit random, isn't it? There's really no connection between Beatles albums and Team Handball. It gets a little bit better, but not much if we say, if you like the first three Beatles albums you heard, you'll probably like rugby. Why is that better? Well, rugby's at least British, but that's pretty weak. In both of those cases on the right, there's really not that much basis to predict anything about liking a particular sport based on liking a few musical albums. So, all other things being equal, an analogy is stronger to the extent that the known commonality and the potential commonality are more closely related, more similar. All right, now let's talk about disanalogies. Disanalogies are a category unto themselves for two reasons. First of all, any of the things that we've already covered can be considered a disanalogy when it weakens the inference. That is, on the negative side of the factors we've already covered, they're all disanalogies. But in addition, there are so many other ways that an analogy can be weak. There's so many other differences to point out in an analogy that we call all of those disanalogies. So disanalogies will include the negative side of anything that we've talked about so far, plus anything else that weakens an analogy. Like, we don't usually tie our shoes around our necks. So, tying a bow tie is like tying your shoes, except we don't tie shoes around necks. We can say that if the first three Smith brothers are good in math, then the fourth Smith brother will probably be good in math, except that brothers, even twins, are different people with different brains, right? That's a disanalogy. That's a reason to be a little bit uncertain or to lose a little bit of confidence in the inductive inference that we're making there. Or with the Beatles analogy, now Team Handball just has nothing to do with taste in music, So we need to be skeptical about any analogy based on that. The key point here is that you always have to consider both the factors that make an analogy stronger and the factors that make it weaker. This has got to be the number one failing I've ever seen in people making arguments. Arguments on essay tests, arguments when defending papers in front of a panel, arguments in court. We are not, as a species, very good at and very creative and very diligent about thinking of all the ways that we might be wrong. And that's really what we're doing when we're saying you always have to consider disanalogies. You find a good analogy, that's great. There are going to be some things that are similar and some things that are not similar. Well, how dissimilar are the things that are not similar? Is it so dissimilar that maybe that's not a very good analogy at all? This also helps us understand a pretty key concept that it's a word we all know, but that few of us could define, and it's the word relevant. We all know that's relevant. Oh, that's irrelevant. But we consider things relevant if it tends to make our conclusion more or less probable. And we're pretty good at finding relevant support for our views. What we're less good at is finding relevant reasons not to hold the views that we hold. Relevant reasons to give it a second thought, to think twice. And sometimes people think that only the stuff that's positive is relevant, but no, the stuff that's negative is very relevant. If we're trying Smith for a carjacking in Chicago, and evidence is offered that Smith was actually in Boston on that day, well, that's very relevant evidence. It doesn't support the thesis. You might say, in some sense, that it's unconnected to the thesis because it's not part of the case that's being laid out for the thesis. But it's very relevant because it absolutely undermines the thesis. This is that disconfirming piece of evidence. That is also very, very relevant. And we're going to use that concept as something we come back to again and again in Chapter 11 when we're considering informal fallacies. So that is strength and weakness in analogies, and I'll be back next time to talk about reasoning about causation.